All right, everyone. Welcome back to A Plateful of Insights, hosted by Revive Wellness Radio. As you've heard me a couple of handful of times by now, if you don't know my name, I'm Brandon. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm also the manager of Revive. And Matthew's back again with me. I haven't had an episode with him for a few episodes now. So, Matt, you wanted to intro yourself?
Yes, so I am Matthew. I'm a dietitian at Revive Wellness here with Brandon, and I primarily work in the areas of things like chronic disease management, as well as prevention and just general health and wellness, as well as things like food allergies and food intolerances.
Very nice. Yeah, I guess since you mentioned those pieces, the areas that I work in uh, are a little bit different. I work in sports nutrition. I work with plant-based eaters, vegetarians, vegans, you name it, as well as people with ADHD, or a combination of all three. Sometimes I'm lucky and get a combination of all three. So we cover a broad scope, the two of us, which is pretty cool. And we're here to talk this episode. We were talking before we started recording to see what aspects of men's health that we wanted to go through. So the topic today we're discussing is men's health in the general sense, and of course, being dietitians, we're unsurprisingly going to focus on nutrition. But we have a few other areas that we wanted to focus on. So we'll see what we can get through with our chat today. But we may split this into two. We'll see what happens. We'll at least get through nutrition. We have some interesting points to talk about with nutrition and also physical activity. Now, of course, June being Canadian Men's Health Month. I got that correct, right, Matthew?
Yes, that is
Okay.
correct.
Okay, very good. I was like, I was as I was saying it, I'm like, yeah, my brain's gonna switch the words around. Um, I mean, umpteen different topics that we can go down. But since that is the month that we're in, we wanted to take a crack at going into some areas and give our spin on a few different pieces um, related to nutrition, lifestyle, physical health, mental health, and so on. So I'm looking forward to this chat quite a bit. I've had many conversations with actually not even just my male clients that I work with, but I mean, people that have obviously males in their lives, fathers, sons, brothers, friends, whatever else. So it always comes up in some way. Um, where do you want to dive into first, Matthew? Do you want to go nutrition first?
Yes, I think that today we can start off with nutrition. And the first point we wanted to discuss had to do with protein. So there are a few different, what we would call macronutrients in food, one being protein, one being carbohydrates, and one being fat, primarily those three. And one that tends to be more of a focus for males. We found both in terms of like working with clients and just general, even like online media, online marketing, and all of that largely tends to go back to protein. And
Shocker. I've
yeah,
Why am I not surprised? I'm sure probably a lot of you listening or watching are probably just like, yeah, you're like, no shit. Yeah. Makes sense.
yes. And the thing there is that a lot of this also goes back to promoting it in the context of like muscle mass or uh, exercise, sports nutrition, and that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
while it is important, it is also just one of three. And the issue there that we're seeing is that this leads to kind of a lack of balance when it comes to people's meals or snacks in terms of an excessive focus on just that protein, where it can take away from other aspects of the diet and can also even come along with some um, drawbacks or negative things to consider.
Totally. I think a lot of that may came from, and particularly in the area that I work in, this uh, kind of perception or this desire or messaging around more is better. You know, I'm a I'm a man. I have a lot of muscle, or maybe even not. I'm just a man. I need more protein. It's kind of synonymous in some cases with masculinity in a way, and so there's this need for more, 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 which then, of course, to the point Matthew you mentioned around balance, it starts to drown the other ones out, or in some cases, erases it off the plate entirely, which is
Mhm.
not good either. Now, I guess a point there is validity to this in some ways, where men need more protein, but it's not in the way that it's commonly thought of when we look at nutrition requirements. So, how much protein does somebody actually need? And of course, we're just focusing on this one because it's relevant in the conversation. The same could be said for a lot of other nutrients too. We look at requirements in a couple different ways. Relative nutrition requirements. Now, really, all that means is how much protein do you require for your body size? How many grams of protein per kilogram of total body weight? Now, between males and females, um, not really a ton difference there. Where it really comes into play is absolute requirements. So when you actually plug in your body mass to that, then of course the total grams that you actually need per day will be higher. And but it is often the case where the perception of what people's actual needs are they think they need more than they actually do, which then feeds into it even more. It's like a cycle. You had a few points, Matthew, around plant proteins. What were you thinking around plant proteins?
Yes, another thing relating to males' perceptions and preferences when it comes to protein is that this tends to be seen as a situation where something like uh, protein and meat are thought of as synonymous when there are a lot of plant based proteins, like, of course, things like beans, things like lentils, uh, sources of soy, things like tofu. And for a lot of males, those things are either it might be considered it might be connected to like societal views of masculinity, but they're not seen as like foods for males. It's seen male proteins are seen more of like things that you can grill or things that you can barbecue. And I've seen some reluctance disproportionately with males to try some plant based sources of protein, even though it comes with some additional health benefits compared to a lot of meat sources of protein.
Yeah, don't get me started on the topic around soy proteins and males, man. It's gonna lower your testosterone and it's gonna give me man boobs. Like how many times have I heard that? Like it's wild. Which is funny that you mentioned like the synonymous between protein and meat is just yeah. I mean the cooking methods. Um, I mean you can grill pretty much any plant protein you want. Obviously, don't pour beans onto a barbecue grill, but like you can form it into something
Mhm.
that can be grilled. Um, I mean, when I think back to my upbringing, my childhood, um, as a man, or a boy, male, it was definitely impacted by that. Like a lot of focus on certain things, the messages that I internalized from family, friends, the focus on things like body composition and muscle mass and all this. And so either kind of naturally or just by what you're actually seeing, there's this, you start to draw a connection between certain things. And that was kind of what I was exposed to when I was younger too, around things like meat, protein, just the balance of meals and things like this, and how different people in my family viewed different things. And so, of course, you start to associate that in different ways when I grew up, anyways. So I
Mhm.
can definitely appreciate that for sure. You have an interesting little piece of info around a different component of the plate being fruits and vegetables. Tell me a little bit about what you found there.
Yeah, so this is somewhat of a continuation of the focus on protein. So I mentioned that an excessive focus on one part of the diet or of a meal can displace other things. And some research does suggest that in addition to the higher meat consumption, males are also less likely to be getting the recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables for their age and sex. It is so although the and also I should also specify that yes, males tend to have higher recommended numbers of servings and such, but even just as a proportion of meals and even an absolute numbers of servings of fruits and vegetables in some age ranges, these are often lower in males.
I guess whoever's listening and watching to this could pause the episode and or continue and just reflect on that point. And I think it's interesting because I would agree that based on what I've seen, that either from a focus perspective or knowledge perspective, all of which leads to actual consumption, I would definitely say that across the whole, that is what I see, for sure. I'm curious. I mean, some of the stuff that we've already talked about feeds into this concept, like you mentioned, related to the protein piece. I mean, it's interesting to dig into thing, like a reluctance to consume more fruits and vegetables, or what we would potentially label as reluctance. It could be anything like, I don't know that they need to consume more. I don't care about fruits and vegetables. They don't taste good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, around why that stat actually exists. It's interesting to dig into.
Yeah, or even just stronger preferences built at a younger age and then continued over time. Could be, yeah, a lot of factors there.
I mean, I just thought of this point. I mean, I have seen memes upon memes and jokes on the internet about like people thinking about their upbringing and like people like when they were growing up, guardians, parents, siblings, friends, cooking vegetables, but then not cooking them properly. Not that there is like a proper way to do it, but let's be honest. If you overcook Brussels sprouts or broccoli, it's not the most pleasant experience.
No.
It is just so yeah. And I definitely picture that in my mind. It's not until I learned to cook certain vegetables with the lid off the pot if you're cooking them in a pot. But like if you grew up with that type of a thing, of course, it makes total sense that you're going to expect that type of an experience most times that you have something like a vegetable because you're just like, oh, this is what it's supposed to be, or this is what it's like. Um, so if you don't know to go outside of something like that, or whatever the case may be for all of you listening to it or watching, then how are you supposed to know, right?
Yeah, and even just that, like food preparation and cooking piece, that also seems to play a big role in the preferences or the habits that people develop and continue. For example, girls are more likely to be involved in the meal preparation at a younger age and at least be learning some skills to prepare the food. And even if they're being taught to prepare it in a way they don't like, there's going to be a greater ability there to modify that and maybe try something a little different. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, just having that lower amount of food skills can also play a role in these choices.
Yeah. I mean, if you even think of people that I've talked to about, depending on where you grew up and where you lived, if it was a school that had access to a lot of resources, they had a foods class. I mean, you think back to anybody that was in a foods class or a home economics class or whatever it was called, that you cooked recipes, you learned to cook different things and such, and what the proportion of um, male versus female was in those classes. Because I can tell you, the ones that I heard about, it was exactly that. There was more girls involved in those pieces, and I mean, it's probably due to like, I don't know. The most thing I can think of is just how people are brought up, what they're exposed to, and societal norms would say. But I'm gonna tie it back again. Um, the the flip side of that is the interest that I've seen in males later in adult life into things like protein, like cooking proteins. things like knives, kitchen knives, butchery, those types of things. So it's like an interest there in those areas that I've seen quite a bit of for adults. So it's like it's there, but it continues kind of in a similar direction as to what we've already talked about. Generally speaking, obviously there's nuance there, but ultimately leads to some of the statistics that you've mentioned. So, yeah. Do we want to move on to physical activity and see what we can do there?
I think that before we go on to that one, maybe we can just discuss some of the key takeaways here that people can use in order to try to improve some nutrition habits.
Good idea. I like it. What are you thinking?
So I think just starting with what you were mentioning at the beginning about nutrition requirements for those who are more active and aiming to change body composition, what do you generally recommend with your male clients?
Ooh, um, usually it's a conversation around. I mean, sometimes I do calculations with people and talk about recommendations. Like most of the clients that I work with, if they're somewhat active, uh, they're looking at like 1.4 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. For the average person that's like not super active or like only a couple times a week kind of thing, you can probably hover on the bottom end of that range, or like 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight and above. So if we're talking about somebody that's I don't know, 100 kilos or so, um, that ends up being 120 grams of protein at least, which is really not that much. And then taking that example, what we would actually look at that and then quantify what that is in food, because at that point I'd have some people's food journals in front of me to look at that. And then say, okay, well, this is what you're doing. This is what you're currently doing it compared to suggestions, recommendations, things like that. And usually the strategy there is an awareness strategy of just getting people aware of like this is what you're actually doing compared to what you actually need per se. And depending on what that discrepancy is, can kind of like, oh, okay. Because if I could go in there and I just say, hey, you don't need that much, you just bring it down. One, they're going to be like, well, sure, okay. But then what's the difference actually? And then a focus, I mean, the points that you mentioned around like a lack of skills, if like what is the barrier there? Is it an awareness thing? Is it a knowledge thing? Is it a skill thing? Access, you name it, trying to find a barrier that's getting in the way there and just finding a solution for it. What about your clients that you
Right.
work with? How do you approach it?
Yeah, similarly. So looking at where things are currently in terms of how much they're getting, initially trying to, depending on their goals and their desires, either trying to get something in each meal and each snack that is a proportionate amount, about a quarter of the meal if we want to visualize it in a bowl or a plate,
Mm-hmm.
and then really just like similar range to what you said, starting maybe at that lower end if they're far from it, and then tracking progress, seeing if maybe they are on the higher end of those requirements and adjusting as needed.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I wanted to add, just in terms of takeaways from this nutrition portion, is that earlier I mentioned how it is really a balance between not just the protein, but the fat and the carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And to connect back to some of that physical activity requirements, it's important to recognize why each of these things are important for exercise. So, for example, making sure that we're getting enough carbohydrates is going to help with that muscle recovery process and that synthesis of muscle tissue. And
Mm-hmm.
making sure that we are getting enough fat, for example, is going to help with ensuring that we're not going so low that we're interfering with anything like hormonal production, which again, you said is a concern for some males when it comes to nutrition and to physical activity. And just again making sure we have all that balance, as well as the micronutrients like the vitamins and minerals from those fruits and vegetables are also playing a role in all of these functions in the body, just going properly as they should. And then lastly, with the plant proteins, ensuring we're getting enough fiber is going to be good for our overall digestive health, and avoiding having maybe anything there even interfering with some of those exercise routines, and just again general health of our gut and our bodies.
Aside from intolerances and allergies, I have yet to come across a situation with the client or hearing from somebody, whether it was a client or not, where increasing the amount of fruit and vegetable that they were consuming on a daily basis, um, I've yet to hear a situation where that didn't lead to an improvement in something. Energy level, performance, gut, digestion, gut health in general sense, how you feel, sleep. Like, it's just, and obviously there's domino effects to it, but I think the point there is huge in that. Well, if you really value and find importance in things like exercise and heck, building muscle, even, it's not just protein there. There's other pieces to the puzzle that are important. And some of you probably are thinking as we're saying this, like, duh, but it's like, okay, well, it's the reality. So, and I mean, we can't talk about it and not mention it, really. What would we be doing? um, Now, um, I mentioned earlier that I'm like, oh, I wonder how long it's going to take us to get through this piece. Like I said, we talk for hours about this stuff. I think one, like, we could probably expand on more nutrition pieces if we wanted to. And two, I want to make sure that we dive into the physical activity piece, and give it a good amount of time. We also want to get into topics around mental health and social well-being. Can't remember if I mentioned that before. So I think now would probably a good natural break for us to wrap this one up, and save the time for the next episodes to make this kind of a little mini series. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. We will see everyone in the next episode to discuss more of that physical activity piece, and maybe how some of that nutrition connects to physical activity in a little more detail. And then, as Brandon said, we'll also be discussing topics this month that relate to things like mental health and social well being in ways that are specific to males.
Very good. We'll see you all in the next one.